Welcome back, America. Listeners of this show know that Matt Pottinger and Mary Kissel, both national security experts who served in the Trump administration, began as Wall Street Journal reporters covering China, and they know China like very few people do. So when a Wall Street Journal reporter, Chunhanwong, came out with a new book on Xi Jinping called A Party of One, I immediately bought it and listened to it. And I now know more about Xi than I ever dreamed of knowing. Chunhan Wong joins me now. Chunhan, welcome. Congratulations. This is a very good book. How long did it take you to write? And are the People's Republic of China mad at you?
Thanks, Hugh. Thanks for having me on the show. And well, I took about 2+ years to write this book. As you would have seen, having listened to it or read it, I was actually forced to leave mainland China. I was based in Beijing from 2014 to 2019. I was forced to leave in 2019, partly because of a story I co-wrote about Xi Jinping's cousin. And after that, I decided that, if I'm going to write a book about China, I had to start writing it as soon as possible while my observations are fresh. And that's when I started the process. I pitched the book to agent and then got contract. And then within about 2.5 years or so, managed to put it out to the world. And hopefully it will be of use to anyone who wants to understand how Xi Jinping has changed China over the past 10 years, remade the Communist Party in its own image.
It is so comprehensive. I don't know how you learned all of that. You're going to have to tell me how you actually figured out Xi's career in life and how he became Xi. And I want Americans to understand, if they had had in 1939 a good bio of Hitler, if they had had in 1940 a good bio of Tojo, they would have been ready. And now we have a great bio of Xi Jinping from Chunhan, and they need to read this or listen to it. Like I listen to books, so I don't have great notes on this. I just have to work off of memory. But could you begin by explaining how Xi actually really did suffer during the early years of his life, like many people did under Mao, but he took a very different lesson than Deng Xiaoping did from those years of suffering?
Yes, indeed. So the first chapter of the book actually focused a lot on Xi Jinping's rise to power from the moment he was born in 1953. You talked about the suffering that he went through. So it's important to note that actually in his very early years of his life, he wasn't suffering. He was born to a very, revolutionary power couple, as I described in the book. They're a powerful family. The father was the propaganda minister at the time. He became a vice premier. And then what changed for Xi was in 1962, Xi Jinping's father, Xi Zhongxun, was actually purged. People nowadays would say it was a trumped up charges. Whatever the case, the downfall of his father actually put a lot of impact on Xi's life, because it meant that he went overnight from someone who had a relatively privileged upbringing to someone who's considered what you call in China at the time a black gang child. That means a son of someone who's politically disgraced. And that impacted his upbringing. When the Cultural Revolution started in 1966, he could not join the Red Guards, which is the group of militant students who basically became Mao's shock troops, in that mass movement. Xi Jinping was sort of an outcast. He could not be part of that group. Eventually, he was, persecuted by other Red Guards to the extent that he decided he had to leave Beijing because he didn't want to put up with that treatment anymore. And he actually went down to the countryside and spent 7 years there. And that, in his recollections, and people who spent those years with him would tell you, those years were very important in forming his worldview. It actually sharpened him and gave him, toughened him up. And somehow in this process, he did not lose faith in the party. Where other people sort of decided that the party mistreated me, I'm going to turn my back on them. He actually doubled down and said he's going to be more red than other people. He's more red than red. And this eventually set him on a path to joining the party and eventually rising through the system. And now where he is now, which is becoming the top leader of China.
He is a hardcore Leninist, and people have to read A Party of One to get the details on what went on in his youth and his rise to power. And we're not going to be able to do that there, but I think people need to understand his rise to power. They have to understand how the party works, and they have to lose. And I labored under this for a long time, Chunhan, because I worked for Richard Nixon, and I used to believe that China was going to evolve once they joined the World Trade Organization. I bought the whole deal. Xi just turned everything backwards, as you illustrate in the book. Can you describe how ardent a communist he is and how much he believes in the party? And the second key question, we'll have to go into the next segment, so leave it for then, is he going to invade Taiwan? But first, how ardent a communist is Xi?
I think that is not so easy question to answer in terms of how much of the hardcore Marxist beliefs that he truly holds in his heart, but in terms of what he has done, what we can analyze his actions and his public speeches, and from that we can clearly see this pattern of his belief that the Communist Party rule over China must not be compromised. Everything is done since he took power in 2012 is to try to reinforce and make sure the Communist Party's leadership over all of Chinese society cannot be damaged, and in fact, everything is done is to reinforce it, ensure that the party's reach enters into every aspect of public life, enters into virtually every social organization, public institution, government agencies. He wants to make sure the party is so entrenched in Chinese society, its control over it, and its ability to govern China could never be shaken, at least within this lifetime, and perhaps for as long as it can endure. In terms of how this impacts.
Stand by, Chun Han. I've got to go to a break. I'm going to come back. This will all play tomorrow morning. It'll be on the podcast today. Chun Wong's brand new book, that's almost brand new, is called A Party of One. I just put the link to it on my X account. It will be in today's podcast notes, and I'm going to play the rest of this interview tomorrow morning in the first hour. So do not miss tomorrow if you don't get the podcast, and if you get the podcast, you'll get it early. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Harley. Thank you, Dwayne. I'm Hugh Hewitt. I am back now with Chun Wong, the author of A Party of One. He's a Wall Street Journal reporter, excellent reporter, superb book. I listened to it. I don't have my elaborate sets of notes because I did not read it. I listened to it. But boy, do I understand. I thought I knew about Xi Jinping because Matt Pottinger and Mary Kissel and Robert O'Brien are friends, and Bill Barr is a friend. I mean, I've gotten their briefs on what they think has happened in China, but I didn't really get the details till I listened to your book, Chun Han. The key question I've been doing all morning with Ambassador Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia, now Ambassador to Washington, D.C., with Jim Talent, with everybody I've been asked, is Xi really going to do this, invade Taiwan? I want to put this as a speculative question to you. Do you think he will really do this?
So I think he does speak about Taiwan in much more ardent terms than some of his recent predecessors. We know from people who attended meetings with him that when he discusses Taiwan issues, he doesn't need to read off a script. He knows what he's going to say. He speaks with it with more fervor than say other issues where he might need to refer to his notes. But I think that doesn't necessarily mean he does want to take sort of decisive action to resolve what they would call the Taiwan issue. Basically, as you know, the Chinese Communist Party's position is Taiwan is a part of China, and therefore it has to be reunified with the motherland sooner or later. Obviously, the people in Taiwan may have different views, but in terms of whether he wants to actually take action, decisive military action to take Taiwan, I'm not sure that's so clear cut. Because you have to understand that a decision like that will be very weighty. It will definitely be associated with him. I like to refer to a Chinese TV show. There's a scene about the Kangxi Emperor, one of the most famous emperors in Chinese history. There's this drama. There's a moment where he decides that I want to go and lead an expedition to the northwest of China himself. And one of his ministers actually tells him, if you do so, you must have 100% assurance of success. Any failure in such an expedition led by the emperor himself would have very dire consequences for his legitimacy and perhaps the entire empire. So for Xi Jinping to want to do this, he must understand that he could potentially be betting the house. If any failure of such a momentous decision could lead to his own personal control being damaged, lost, or perhaps it could damage the credibility and the legitimacy of the Communist Party. So if, in fact, when people ask me this question, I tend to think that the greater risk at the moment tends to come from accidental clashes. We do know that the PLA has engaged in far greater frequency and of operations around Taiwan. They've conducted drills since Nancy Pelosi's visit in August 2022 to Taipei that they've done what they call encirclement. They fire rockets, they sail ships and aircraft around the island to demonstrate the ability to blockade it if necessary. And there's also increased activity from the US and other Western powers in terms of sending warships into the Taiwan Strait. We do know that some US troops are on the ground in Taiwan, conducting joint training with Taiwanese. There is a risk that there may be accidental clashes between these forces, and that may force either side into escalating and take us into a state where we would not like to see, which is actual shooting conflict.
Chun Han, earlier today with Ambassador Rudd, I relayed to him an email I got last night from an active duty Marine Corps officer, so I won't say their name, but a very smart Marine Corps officer who said, China is doing to Taiwan what Hamas did to Israel. They are desensitizing America to these encirclements, to these overflights. They're trying to get us used to it. My reply was, no, they're trying to exhaust Taiwan. He said, no, they're trying to get us to be oblivious to what they're really doing. What do you think that this signal? Are they trying to pull the Hamas desensitization? I don't know how to say the word. Are they trying to get us used to their doing these antics?
I think they're not mutually exclusive. There is a very practical effect of stepping up frequency of PLA operations around the island. On the one hand, you are improving the PLA's capabilities to conduct these operations. The Chinese would consider them joint operations. Some other military experts may disagree, but whatever you assess them to be, they are ways to try to demonstrate and improve Chinese capabilities to operate in that space. They also force the Taiwanese, if they choose to engage every time, send up aircraft to intercept or send warships to intercept, then you will force them to exhaust their capabilities. There are some Taiwanese military experts who think that the Taiwanese armed forces should not try to engage every time the Chinese come up, because you're only expanding your own capabilities, you're weakening your own readiness. Therefore, you should only choose to respond where you deem is absolutely necessary. So there is a practical component to this, but I think that it would be, remiss to not acknowledge that there is potentially a very strong psychological component, which is to wear down the sort of sensitization to such operations, make people think this is common, this is usual, and perhaps even sort of demonstrate to Taiwanese people that, we have absolute ability to conduct full-scale military operations in Taiwan. You should forget about defending yourself. I think there is some sort of psychological element to these operations, but it's not clear whether it's achieving these goals. There are some signs that, Taiwanese sense of self-identity, basically people in Taiwan identifying as Taiwanese versus identifying as Chinese, that has only increased over the years. Right now, I think it's around 66%, about 2/3 of Taiwanese identify as Taiwanese, as opposed to mainland Chinese. And that trend is probably only going to increase as more and more young people who have very little cultural and physical connections to the mainland, they are only going to identify themselves increasingly as Taiwanese only.
Chun, after I listened to A Party of One, I also then read a thriller about China ordering the invasion of Taiwan by Jack Carr, very, very famous thriller writer in the United States, called Red Sky Morning. In Red Sky Morning, I learned a few things, which I double checked. I'm going to yell at Pottinger and Kissel and Pompeo and O'Brien about, because no one told me this stuff. Maybe they don't know. China attacked Guam, our naval base in Guam, with a cyber attack in 2023. In 2020. News of that surfaced in 2023. I did not know that. I missed that story. Do you have any idea if the United States responded in kind to what China did? Because if we did, I'm unaware of it. But there's a secret war always going on. I just don't know what we don't know.
I'm not aware of any specific American response to such an attack if it did happen. But I think it's quite clear from public comments from both sides, both from the CIA and also British intelligence, MI6, MI5, and also the Chinese Ministry of State Security, which is their equivalent of CIA. There's been this sort of public jousting on both sides. If you recall a few, I think last year, CIA Director Bill Burns actually said that Americans intelligence services have rebuilt some sort of capabilities in China, and the Chinese very quickly after that, the State Security Ministry came out with a number of what they would call revelations that they had busted or arrested people who were spying on behalf of Western intelligence services, the CIA, MI6, so on and so forth. There's this public sort of battle over perceptions that both sides are trying to show that they have stepped up their intelligence efforts against the other side. And I think this we can only expect it to continue. What happens beneath the surface, we can never be entirely sure. But I think if you're seeing this sort of activity on the surface in public comments about each other, we can only expect that there's probably a lot more going on underneath the surface.
All right, Chun Han, I've covered extensively, and this occurred after your book went to print, or when you were writing it. Between 40 and 60,000 Chinese nationals have crossed over the southern border in the United States. Prior to that time, it was dozens or hundreds max. What does that represent to you? Are we paying enough attention to that? And does that happen by accident? I don't know how easy it is to get out of China.
My colleagues actually wrote a story about this attempt to get to China out of China and to the U.S. through this route. And also wrote stories myself about other people who tried to leave China through these what you would call extra legal means, because some of these people actually do not have the legal right to leave the country. They were subject to what you would call exit bans, or they were denied passports, or the Chinese authorities are actually targeting them for various reasons, for example, religious persecution, and try to stop them from leaving the country through the normal channels. And I think, according to United Nations data, as me and my colleagues have reported previously, there is an indication that the number of people who are attempting to seek asylum from China has increased since Xi Jinping took power in 2012. There are many potential reasons as to why more people are willing to make this escape. One would imagine the increased amount of political controls, political pressure put on various constituencies, various groups of people in China would have compelled some of them to make the decision to leave. I wrote a story a couple of years ago about how an entire congregation from the southern Chinese city of Shenzhen actually decided to uproot themselves, move the entire congregation out of Shenzhen, out of mainland China, and they actually first went to South Korea, where they stayed for a period of time while trying to figure out the options. They moved to Thailand, and eventually they managed to secure access to leave Thailand with help from United Nations Refugee Agency and from the United States government. They actually eventually moved to the United States. So the reason they gave was religious persecution, but there are others who have attempted to leave out of other reasons. For example, political persecution, people who, for example, human rights lawyers, activists, journalists who felt their work was being targeted by authorities and their personal freedoms were being impinged upon, and they decided that they don't want to stay in China anymore, and they decided to make the leap of faith and try to leave China through. Some of these channels are actually quite risky and quite dangerous, but which makes you wonder, like, what sort of pressure do they feel at home that makes them decide to take such a risk?
Well, I would never want to do the Darien Gap, but I'm wondering, are any of them sent by the communists?
What do you mean by sent?
No, they're spies. They're infiltrators. I asked Donald Trump this the last time I interviewed him. What do you make of this? He said they're building an army. I think that's a little bit extreme, but is it possible that some percentage of this 40 to 60,000 are in fact sent?
I wouldn't want to make a guess on that. I have no information in this regard, but I would think, based on my own reporting, having interacted with people who have made such attempts to leave China, some succeeded, some failed. I think quite a lot of them are genuine, what you would call asylum seekers. They have they have been able to demonstrate to some extent whether, if they sought asylum through official channels, they demonstrated that they have faced persecution at home. Some of these people are sort of fairly famous. If you follow dissident and activist circles in China, you will have seen them in the news, see them carry out certain activities to try to advocate for human rights. And that brought them some form of political persecution upon them, and they responded by trying to leave China. So there are quite a few documented cases, including stories that I've written about, where I would think these people are genuinely trying to leave what they feel is an oppressive environment. I can't speak to the rest, but I think having seen the reporting by my colleagues and other media outlets, I think it's fair to say quite a lot of them are genuinely motivated. They do see the United States as a land of opportunity, and they want to find ways to get there. And in fact, they spend a lot of money, bring entire families, and takes great risks, because the Darien Gap is a very treacherous path. And to decide to want to do that, I think you have to take a degree of commitment and daring to want to attempt it.
Chun-Han, two more questions, and thank you for your extra time today. The first one has to do with, as you described, Xi purged people who competed with him, and he's promoted people who agree with him. The Standing Committee of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party has 7 people, of whom Xi is one, and they're all loyalists. Does he ever face a Khrushchev moment? 1964, the Politburo in the Soviet Union decides Khrushchev has been reckless, and he doesn't show up one day, and Brezhnev and Gromyko and another guy take over. Does Xi have any vulnerability from within?
You can never say never, but based on what we know, based on the sort of composition of the key bodies in the Communist Party system, whether it's the Standing Committee of the Politburo, the Central Committee, the Central Military Commission, which commands the armed forces, based on what we know of the current composition, they are all staffed by people who are seen as loyal to Xi Jinping. And we've seen a wave of purges as recently as recent weeks where ministers, people as high-ranking as ministers do get purged. The agricultural minister was purged recently. As you know, the foreign minister and the defense minister were abruptly removed from their positions last year. A lot of people speculate that is to do with wrongdoing, of which the Chinese government has yet to explain. So there is an ongoing effort to maintain the sort of loyalty and discipline that Xi has enforced over since he took power in 2012. As I write in the book, I devote an entire chapter to this, which is how Xi Jinping has consolidated power. He basically uses the party's anti-corruption agency as a coercive tool. Investigate people for corruption. You take down your potential rivals, political networks. You investigate their secretaries, their drivers, their wives, and you may not have to go after the person himself, but he would have had plenty of warning. He understands that if he were to rise against Xi, he would have no chance because people around him, his networks have been eliminated.
And my last question, Chun-Han, at the end of Party of One, he's consolidated power completely. He's got loyalists everywhere. He's ideologically committed. And he has said publicly, Taiwan should reunify by 2027. And so I think he's kind of out there on a limb with that kind of rhetoric. And I'm afraid if Joe Biden loses, there's a transition period where the United States is typically paralyzed in national security affairs. When Biden is leaving, Team Trump is coming in. Would you worry about that period in time more than you generally worry about an attack on Taiwan?
First of all, I think I need to clarify something. I think the 2027 date is not actually associated with Taiwan explicitly. The 2027 date is actually the 100th anniversary of the PLA. So there's been some speculation that there might be an attempt to demonstrate some sort of progress with the modernization of the PLA, because you have to show results, right? You want to be able to demonstrate that after 100 years of evolution in the People's Liberation Army, it's achieved a certain level of capabilities. Whether that involves Taiwan, I don't think is necessarily the case. What has been touted as a sort of implicit timeline are dates like, for example, 2035, which is a date that Xi Jinping set as a sort of intermediary timeline for reaching certain modernization goals for China. There's also 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic. And there are people who have said within the Chinese system, they have said that if by that point in time, the PRC is not territorially unified, then we aren't such a great country after all. So there have been comments that led people to speculate that maybe 2049 is this target, that you want to unify Taiwan by then. But 2049 is pretty far away. So I think that sort of, as a politician, as Xi Jinping, you wouldn't want to set too hard a target because you also constrain your own choice of action. And if 2049 is sort of distant enough that you just give yourself some breathing room, right? If you wanted to...
Well, the 2027 date I've read in a lot of places. 2049 I've heard about since I worked for Nixon, a long time ago. And so I don't know where the 2027 came from, but it's in circulation. Let me close by just saying thank you. It's a great book, A Party of One. How is it done? Is there appetite among Americans to learn about Xi?
I hope so. I mean, I think China being the second biggest economy in the world, one of the most powerful militaries, one of the most populous nations, it is and will remain a consequential power for a very long time to come. And if you want to understand how this nation functions, now under so clearly controlled, under the control of one person, if you don't even begin to understand how he thinks, how he operates, what he wants to achieve, then we are shortchanging ourselves. You're not giving us the best possibility to engage with this power.
Tremendous service that you've done, Chunhanwong. Thank you. The book is A Party of One. Go out and get it right now. You will enjoy it. I recommend the audiobook. I think it's fabulous, but I'm sure the book is easier for some people to read rather than listen to. Thank you, Chun-Han. Talk to you again soon, I hope.
Thank you very much, Hugh. Hope to speak to you soon.
Bye-bye.